My name is Carolyn Sachs. I was born on January 20th, 1931. My maiden name was Carolyn Tambor. I have two sisters. One is my twin, Frida. My older sister's name is Florence. My parents' names were Esther and William Tambor. They were born in Hungary, and my father was born in 1888, and my mother was born in 1891. They were born in different areas. My father came here when he was about 15, and my mother came here when she was about 12. My father was one of 7. They had big families there. And his father came to the United States and sent for his children 2 by 2. His wife had died in childbirth after the last child was born. You see, my parents never talked about this. It was very painful for them. They left Europe. They were all very, very poor. And so it was the big migration of all of the Europeans to come and find a better life in the United States. My father and his brother, they walked from Hungary to the port of embarkation in Hamburg, Germany. They walked by night, and they caught rides on farmers' wagons, and they slept during the day in barns or in the fields, and they had to avoid the authorities because back then the country drafted the young boys into their army, and they had to serve for about 25 years, so they did not want to get caught. My mother had a different story. She was 12 years old. She was one of 10, and her mother was a widow and very, very poor, and lots of times they didn't have enough to eat. And she, I guess her mother scraped up enough money and sent her by herself with extended family. She came steerage class on a boat out of the southern part of Europe, out of Trieste, which was from the old Yugoslavia. The couple of extended relatives, they were up in cabin class, and my mother was alone down there, and she was sent to live with an older brother in Brooklyn. The older brother and his wife and family really didn't want her. They were struggling by themselves, and so what they did was that they found a job for her, this 12-year-old, alone with some rich Jewish family in Manhattan, and she was like a servant, a maid and a servant. And how she met my father, I don't know, but all of the Europeans, when they came here, they had to be sponsored by somebody so they wouldn't be a burden on the community or the state. They all settled in enclaves, and the Hungarians, which they were in another area, and I guess that must have been where she met my father. They were married. She was 20, he was 23. They had their first child about a year and a half or 2 later, and this also was a little girl. She Unfortunately, she died when she was about 8 years old. And, they did not have the wonderful medical facilities back in the early 1900s that they have today. And I guess 2 years later, Florence was born. And when Florence was maybe about 7 or so, they didn't want Florence to be an only child. And so guess what? Instead of one kid, surprise, there were 2. My mother was 40 years old when she had twins, and there were no conveniences at that time. So she was washing diapers for 2. She was mashing up food for 2. She was not sleeping when one was crying and then the other was crying. European fathers did not help with any of the female work, so she was really exhausted. My older sister, who just passed away, was Florence, and my twin sister was Frida, and I got the best name of all. My father's name was Murray, and my mother-in-law's name was Rose. His father came from England, and his mother came from Russia. Herb's mother was the oldest, then there was a son, and then there was a younger daughter. Her father was already in the U.S., and her mother was going to come over with 3 children. They lived in a village, and the Cossacks used to come through and pillage the town and sometimes kill the kids or do a lot of damage. And so Herb's mother said that her mother used to hide the kids in one of these great big ovens that they had. Of course, the ovens weren't going at the time, and the Cossacks on horses used to come through and hurt the kids or grab them or something. So this was very scary. But they came over as a family, the mother and the kids. But the mother got sick, and they had to spend several months in Germany. The U.S. would not accept people who were not healthy. Herb's father, he was the oldest. His mother was married to a man whose last name was Cohen. The story was that when he went over to the U.S., he jumped off the ship and committed suicide. Murray's mother got married again, and then there were 3 other children. His brother Harry, his brother Nat, and Julie. The new husband's name was John Isaacs. John adopted my father-in-law, whose first name was really Morris. So his name was Morris Isaacs. He served in the British Army in World War I, and he was over in France in the trenches, and he got wounded, I think, and was sent back for recovery to England. And the story is that either he just never went back, and they never traced him either. There was Great Depression after the First World War, and he and his brother came over here to the U.S. at that time. Herb's mother's family was living somewhere in New York City. They rented out a room to new arrivals, and my father-in-law, I guess, rented a room in my mother-in-law's family's house, and I guess that's how they met and married. He and a cousin and somebody else formed a company. He was a furniture refinisher. And the story is that the third partner was kind of like a crook. He did something illegal, and he ran away with all of the money, and the authorities came after my father-in-law and his cousin, and my father-in-law changed his name to, instead of Morris Isaacs, he became Murray I. Sachs. It was more or less a blind date. In the New York City colleges, they had such a thing called house plan, which was like fraternities and sororities. Her belonged to one from Brooklyn College, and we belonged to one from Hunter College. They arranged, for mixers or get-togethers. His group and our group did have one together, but there were a lot of people there. He was there, I never knew him there. But friends from each of those arranged a blind date. And when he arrived at that time, the boys went to the girls' houses and picked them up. And he rang the bell, and I see this young guy with a great big grin, beautiful smile, and it was a blind date, and that's really how it began. But I was dating other people, other guys. We dated for 2 years, but I was seeing others, and there was one young man who I was as close to as I was to her, and I really had to make a decision after a good while, and they were very much alike. And that's when I went to my sister Florence, and I explained my dilemma. I chose who. I got married on my 21st birthday, January 20th, 1952. This coming January would have been 70 years had he lived. So we had 53 married years together, had 2 wonderful children. Jeffrey's children are Michael and Sarah, and Eddie's children are Shira and Ariel.